Tokyo, winter 1945. The war had ended only months earlier, but the city still looked defeated. Burned tram lines cut through blackened streets. Roofless buildings stood like skeletons against a pale gray sky. In the cold morning air outside a temporary processing center near the imperial capital, dozens of former Japanese women officers waited silently in worn military uniforms that no longer belonged to an empire. Many had not changed clothes in weeks. Inside the building, American occupation workers and Red Cross volunteers unpacked wooden crates shipped from the United States. Wool coats, civilian skirts, cotton blouses, simple leather shoes. Nothing luxurious, just ordinary clothes from another world. One by one, the Japanese women were invited forward. Some bowed stiffly, others refused eye contact. Years of military discipline held their expressions motionless. But when several American women gently placed fresh garments into their hands, something inside the room changed. A lieutenant from the former Imperial Army lowered her face into the fabric of a blue winter coat and began to cry. Around her, others quietly followed. For many Americans, it was humanitarian aid. For many Japanese women, it was the first moment the war truly ended. And behind those tears stood a story far larger than clothing itself. A story born from imperial ambition, total war, collapse, and the fragile beginning of peace. In the years before the Second World War reached its violent peak, Japan had already transformed itself into one of the most militarized societies on Earth. By the late 1930s, the empire stretched across enormous parts of East Asia. Japanese forces occupied Manchuria after 1931. Full-scale war erupted in China in 1937. Cities like Shanghai, Wuhan, and Nanjing became symbols of industrial warfare and mass civilian suffering. Inside Japan itself, newspapers, schools, and radio broadcasts repeated the same message every day. Sacrifice was sacred, obedience was survival, and the emperor stood above all earthly concerns. The military increasingly shaped ordinary life. Food was rationed. Western fashions disappeared from stores. Civilian luxuries became signs of weakness. Women were encouraged to support the empire through factory labor, nursing programs, civil defense organizations, and eventually direct military service roles. Though Japan did not employ women in combat on the scale seen in some Soviet formations, thousands served in communications units, administration, logistics, medical corps, anti-aircraft observation posts, and emergency homeland defense organizations during the final years of the war. Many of these women came from deeply traditional households. They were raised in a culture where public emotional restraint carried enormous social value. Duty came before comfort. Silence came before complaint. By 1944, as American submarines strangled Japanese shipping routes and B-29 bombers began appearing over the home islands, those expectations hardened even further. The war was no longer distant. Entire neighborhoods in Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama disappeared beneath firestorms. Families evacuated children into rural villages. Schools drilled girls to carry bamboo spears in preparation for a possible Allied invasion. Uniforms were patched repeatedly because replacement fabric barely existed anymore. Soap, medicine, rice, and heating fuel became precious commodities. Yet despite the devastation, official propaganda insisted Japan would never surrender. Even after the fall of Saipan in July 1944 placed American bombers within direct range of the Japanese mainland, military leaders publicly promised ultimate victory. Radio announcements spoke of decisive battles that would destroy the enemy. Civilians were instructed to prepare for honorable death rather than occupation. For many Japanese women serving within military structures, surrender itself seemed unimaginable. Then, in August 1945, the world changed within days. On August 6th, the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. On August 9th, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. That same week, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held Manchuria, crushing the Kwantung Army with overwhelming speed. The combined shock shattered the final strategic hopes of the imperial leadership. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio for the first time in history. Many listeners could barely understand the formal imperial language. But they understood one thing. Clearly, Japan had lost. Across the country, military personnel removed insignia from their uniforms. Officers burned documents. Civilians stood silently beside damaged radios, trying to absorb the meaning of surrender after years of promises that surrender would never come. And for thousands of Japanese women connected to the wartime system, the collapse created a terrifying new uncertainty, because the enemy they had been taught to fear was now preparing to enter their homeland. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan in late August 1945, they entered a nation physically shattered and psychologically exhausted. General Douglas MacArthur landed at Atsugi Airfield on August 30th, beginning one of the largest military occupations in modern history. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of Allied personnel spread across the Japanese home islands. Ports reopened under foreign control. Military headquarters were seized. Weapons stockpiles were catalogued and destroyed. Former soldiers returned home. Through cities reduced to ash, Tokyo alone had suffered catastrophic destruction from the March 1945 firebombing campaign. Entire districts no longer existed. The occupation authorities feared famine, disease, and social collapse during the coming winter. Millions were homeless. Rail infrastructure barely functioned. Food shortages drove civilians to black markets where basic rice or cooking oil could cost weeks of wages. Children searched ruins for scrap metal or half-burned wood. Women traded family heirlooms for sweet potatoes and charcoal. And beneath the hunger sat another powerful emotion: fear of the Americans. Japanese wartime propaganda had spent years portraying Allied troops as brutal monsters. Civilians were warned that invasion would bring mass violence and humiliation. Some women carried poison packets during the final months of the war because they believed capture would be worse than death. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, civilians had already committed suicides after hearing terrifying rumors about American forces. But occupation reality unfolded differently than many expected. Strict discipline was imposed on Allied troops. Military police monitored conduct carefully. Relief organizations distributed emergency supplies. Medical teams treated civilians suffering from malnutrition and disease. American churches, charities, women's groups, and Red Cross workers gradually entered devastated communities, carrying blankets, canned food, shoes, and clothing. Among the most emotionally complex encounters were those involving former Japanese military women. Some had served as nurses during bombing campaigns. Others had worked in communications offices, military hospitals, transport administration, or homeland defense support units. Many still wore fading uniforms because civilian wardrobes had been destroyed during air raids. Fabric shortages were so severe that families often remade old curtains or military cloth into everyday garments. For these women, uniforms represented more than clothing. They symbolized years of sacrifice, national identity, discipline, and loyalty to a collapsing empire. Yet the uniforms also tied them to defeat, starvation, and trauma. Some officers reportedly continued wearing them simply because they possessed nothing else. American. Women working in relief operations noticed immediately. Photographs and memoirs from occupation, Personnel describe encounters with exhausted, Japanese women standing in patched tunics, oversized boots, and threadbare winter coats. Aid centers began distributing donated civilian clothing gathered through American humanitarian campaigns. Dresses, cardigans, scarves, gloves, children's coats altered for adults. Simple garments sent across the Pacific by women who had themselves lived through wartime rationing. The exchanges often began awkwardly. Language barriers limited conversation. Formal bows met cautious smiles. Some Japanese women initially refused assistance out of pride or embarrassment. Others accepted items silently, unable to reconcile years of wartime. Hatred with unexpected acts of kindness from former enemies. Then came moments that occupation. Workers would remember for decades, former officers quietly, touching soft fabric after years of military wool. Women staring at mirrors in civilian clothing for the first time since before the war. Tears, appearing without warning, not because the clothes were expensive, but because, in the ruins of defeat, ordinary human dignity suddenly returned to them in the smallest possible form. And from those deeply personal encounters emerged a larger story about how wars truly end, not only through surrender documents and military orders, but through fragile moments between former enemies learning to see one another again. For many former Japanese military women, the uniform had consumed nearly every part of their identity. Before the war, clothing in Japan still reflected civilian individuality. Students wore fashionable Western-inspired coats in Tokyo cafes. Department stores sold silk dresses and imported fabrics. But as the conflict expanded across Asia, personal style slowly disappeared beneath national mobilization. Fabric restrictions tightened. Cosmetics became scarce. Civilian elegance gave way to wartime austerity. Uniforms replaced personality. By 1945, many women serving in military support organizations had worn the same garments through air raids, evacuations, and months of food shortages. The cloth absorbed smoke from bombed cities. Sleeves were repaired repeatedly with mismatched thread. Boots cracked from endless use. Yet military discipline demanded the appearance of order even while the empire itself collapsed. When surrender arrived, those uniforms suddenly became symbols of failure. Some women removed insignia immediately to avoid humiliation. Others kept every badge intact because it was the only remaining structure in their lives. Historians studying post-war Japan often note how difficult psychological demobilization became for former personnel who had spent years inside rigid military systems. Without rank, command, or mission, many felt emotionally untethered. That is why the act of receiving civilian clothes carried such unexpected emotional force. A sweater or winter skirt did more than provide warmth. It represented permission to become human again, outside the machinery of war. The moment a former officer folded away her military jacket, she was not simply changing clothes. She was stepping out of an identity built around sacrifice, obedience, and national survival. And for some, that transition arrived all at once, inside overcrowded aid centers where former enemies handed them garments with quiet compassion. The women distributing clothing in occupied Japan were not frontline soldiers. Most were volunteers, nurses, missionaries, Red Cross workers, military wives, or civilian employees attached to occupation programs. Many had lost relatives during the war themselves. Some came from American towns where gold stars hung in windows for sons killed in the Pacific. Others had spent years working in military hospitals, treating wounded Marines returned from battles like Guadalcanal, Peleliu, and Okinawa. Yet when they arrived in Japan, they encountered something different from wartime propaganda. instead of fanatical enemies. They found exhausted civilians trying to survive among ruins. American occupation records and memoirs often describe the shock experienced by Allied personnel upon seeing Tokyo after the firebombings. Entire families lived inside burned buildings without glass windows. Mothers stood in food lines for hours, carrying infants wrapped in military blankets. Children wandered barefoot through districts that resembled earthquake zones more than functioning cities. Women volunteers became central figures in humanitarian outreach because they could enter social spaces male occupation personnel often could not. They organized clothing drives, nutritional assistance, orphan support, and medical relief. In many cases, female aid workers handled interactions with Japanese women who remained deeply uncomfortable, speaking openly with American military men. The clothing distributions became deeply symbolic. American women frequently brought garments donated by churches or community organizations back home. These were ordinary civilian items once worn during American wartime rationing: practical coats, stitched dresses, wool gloves, school shoes. But in devastated post-war Japan, such items appeared almost impossibly luxurious. Some occupation workers later wrote that the emotional reactions surprised them most. Not gratitude alone. Relief. Because beneath the politics, hatred, and destruction of the Pacific War, many women on both sides recognized something painfully familiar in one another: exhaustion from years of sacrifice demanded by nations at war. And in those brief encounters, the enormous distance between victor and defeated sometimes narrowed into something quieter and far more human. The tears inside those aid centers were not caused by clothing alone. They emerged from the sudden collapse of an entire worldview. For years, Imperial Japan had taught its citizens that endurance defined honor. Military education emphasized emotional control, absolute loyalty, and willingness to suffer for the nation. Public displays of vulnerability were often discouraged, especially among those connected to military institutions. Many women serving in wartime organizations internalized these expectations deeply. Then the empire disappeared almost overnight. The emperor, once presented as sacred and untouchable, announced surrender to the nation. Military leaders who had promised victory vanished into silence. Cities burned, families scattered, food lines replaced patriotic rallies. Millions discovered that the sacrifices demanded from them had led not to triumph, but ruin. Psychologists and historians studying defeated societies often describe moments like these as identity fractures. When belief systems collapse suddenly under catastrophic conditions, ordinary emotional restraint can fail without warning. Small gestures become overwhelming because they pierce emotional defenses built during prolonged crisis. That is why something as simple as receiving clean civilian clothing carried extraordinary psychological weight. The garments represented safety after years of fear, normal life after militarized existence, human care after industrialized destruction. For some former Japanese officers, the emotional impact likely came from another realization as well. The enemy they had been taught to fear was showing them kindness at the lowest point of their lives. That contradiction struck directly against years of wartime conditioning, and in many memoirs from occupied Japan, moments of unexpected kindness often triggered stronger emotional responses than moments of hardship itself. Because hardship had become familiar, mercy had not. Fikris. Pacific War is often remembered through battleships, island invasions, kamikaze attacks, and mushroom clouds. But hidden beneath those enormous military events were millions of quieter stories, carried by women. Japanese women worked in munitions factories where Exhaustion and malnutrition became routine. Nurses treated horrific burn injuries during American bombing raids. Students trained for emergency defense operations with almost no equipment. Mothers struggled to feed children while entire supply systems collapsed around them. The clothing exchanges in occupied Japan revealed an unusual intersection of those parallel experiences. Many of the American women handing out garments understood rationing, wartime anxiety, and separation from loved ones. Some had sewn clothes from reused fabric during shortages at home. Meanwhile, Japanese women receiving those items had endured years of bombardment, hunger, and militarized sacrifice inside a collapsing empire. Neither side escaped the war unchanged. Yet, unlike political leaders or military strategists, these women often met one another without formal negotiations, speeches, or ideology. Their interactions unfolded through practical acts, distributing coats, fitting shoes, adjusting sleeves for children, translating sizes through gestures and broken phrases, small acts. But wars are often remembered most powerfully through moments that reveal ordinary humanity, surviving inside extraordinary destruction. Throughout history, clothing has carried political meaning during wartime. Uniforms establish authority. Armbands define allegiance. Medals symbolize sacrifice. Occupying armies often regulate civilian appearance as part of restoring order after conflict. In post-war Japan, however, clothing also became a visible measure of national collapse. Photographs from late 1945 show civilians wearing patched garments, wooden sandals repaired with wire, and coats made from recycled military cloth. Textile production had nearly disintegrated during the final phase of the war. Air raids destroyed factories. Shipping losses cut supply chains. Civilian manufacturing gave way almost entirely to military necessity. Receiving. American civilian clothes therefore represented more than charity. It symbolized transition. The militarized empire that had demanded absolute sacrifice could no longer provide even basic necessities for its own people. Survival increasingly depended on occupation relief programs, foreign food imports, and international humanitarian assistance. For former Japanese officers, this reality could feel deeply humiliating. Yet the emotional reactions recorded by witnesses suggest something more complex than humiliation alone. Many women cried not simply because they were defeated, but because the clothing restored fragments of dignity that war had stripped away piece by piece. A clean coat, a pair of proper shoes, fabric that smelled new instead of smoky, ruins. These were ordinary objects in peacetime society, but in devastated Japan, they became symbols that life beyond war might still exist. And as winter deepened across the shattered cities of the defeated empire, those fragile signs of recovery began shaping the emotional landscape of occupied Japan itself. By early winter 1945, occupation authorities understood that Japan stood dangerously close to humanitarian disaster. Food reserves had collapsed to critical levels in several urban centers. Millions remained displaced from bombing campaigns. Coal shortages left homes without heat as temperatures dropped across the country. American intelligence reports warned that starvation and civil unrest could spread rapidly if emergency relief failed. Inside Tokyo, long lines formed before dawn outside. Distribution stations. Former soldiers stood beside. Widows. Children carried small containers hoping for soup. Women wrapped thin blankets around infants while waiting in freezing air for ration cards to be stamped. Among the crowds were hundreds of former female military personnel, attempting to disappear quietly into civilian life. Many avoided wearing full uniforms in public now. Buttons and insignia had been removed, caps hidden away. Yet the posture of military discipline still remained visible: rigid backs, controlled expressions, formal bows. Occupation workers noticed them immediately. One temporary relief facility, established near central Tokyo, became known for processing women connected to wartime service organizations. Some had worked in communications units attached to the Imperial Army. Others came from military hospitals, evacuated after bombing raids. Several had traveled back from collapsed overseas positions in Korea, Manchuria, or occupied China with almost nothing except the clothes they wore. Witnesses later described the atmosphere inside the building as tense but strangely quiet. The Japanese. Women rarely spoke unless addressed directly. Many seemed exhausted beyond emotion. Malnutrition had become common by late 1945, particularly among those without surviving family support networks. Some women reportedly fainted while standing in ration queues. Others sold personal possessions for food on black markets, spreading across the capital. Then the American relief shipments arrived, crates stacked with donated civilian clothing from the United States were unloaded into the center over several days. Volunteers sorted garments by size beneath hanging electric lights powered by unstable generators, dresses folded carefully beside wool coats, scarves beside winter gloves, simple civilian shoes arranged in rows across wooden floors still smelling faintly of smoke from nearby ruins. For the American women organizing distribution, the work seemed practical. Japan needed winter clothing, nothing more. But the emotional atmosphere shifted almost immediately once distribution began. A former Japanese officer stepped forward first, still wearing a faded service jacket with rank markings removed. One of the volunteers handed her a dark blue coat lined with wool. The officer accepted it formally with both hands. For several seconds, she simply stared at the fabric. Then her composure broke. According to later recollections from occupation workers, the woman pressed the coat against her face as tears appeared almost instantly. She attempted to bow repeatedly while struggling to speak. Nearby Japanese women lowered their heads silently. Some turned away to hide their own emotions. Others openly wept. The room reportedly fell almost silent except for subdued crying. American volunteers, many expecting suspicion or resentment from former enemy personnel, suddenly found themselves confronting something far more intimate: the visible collapse of years of emotional endurance. One worker later recalled that the women seemed overwhelmed not by luxury, but by softness itself. Soft fabric, clean clothing, ordinary civilian care. After years dominated by militarism, destruction, and survival, these small objects carried emotional meaning far beyond their material value. And as more women entered the distribution line, the emotional barrier separating occupier and occupied began dissolving in ways neither side had anticipated. Emotional scenes inside those relief centers spread quietly through occupation circles. During the winter of 1945, military administrators discussed logistics and reconstruction, statistics in official reports, but humanitarian workers remembered something different: the expressions on the faces of women who had spent years preparing for national sacrifice only to encounter unexpected compassion from former enemies. For many Japanese women officers, the psychological shock unfolded in layers. Only months earlier, American bombers had reduced entire cities to firestorms. News from Hiroshima and Nagasaki still circulated in fragments of horror and disbelief. Families searched endlessly for missing relatives. Former military personnel feared arrest, humiliation, or violent retaliation under occupation rule. Wartime propaganda had conditioned many civilians to expect cruelty from Allied forces. Instead, they found American women adjusting coat sleeves for proper fit, offering scarves against winter, cold, helping exhausted strangers choose shoes from relief piles. Contrast was almost unbearable. Several occupation memoirs describe Japanese recipients apologizing repeatedly while accepting aid. Others bowed so deeply that volunteers tried awkwardly to stop them. Some women hesitated before touching the clothing at all, as if uncertain whether they truly deserved it after defeat. Yet the Americans themselves were also emotionally affected. Many volunteers had crossed the Pacific, carrying their own wartime grief. Brothers lost in naval battles, husbands wounded during island campaigns, years spent reading casualty lists from places whose names had become symbols of brutality: Iwo Jima, Tarawa, Okinawa. The Pacific War had been one of the most vicious theaters of the Second World War. American troops often remembered fierce Japanese resistance, suicide attacks, and refusal to surrender. Japanese civilians remembered incendiary bombings, blockade-induced hunger, and overwhelming destruction from the sky. Hatred had been cultivated intensely on both sides. That is what made these encounters so historically remarkable. Inside damaged buildings lit by temporary generators, women shaped by opposite sides of total war confronted each other not through weapons or propaganda, but through ordinary acts of care. A former Japanese officer crying into a wool coat. An American volunteer quietly placing another garment into trembling hands. No speeches, no treaties, just silence, exhaustion, and the fragile recognition of shared humanity after catastrophe. Historians of post-war Japan often emphasize large political transformations, democratization reforms, war crimes tribunals, constitutional change, economic restructuring. But beneath those enormous historical processes existed countless personal moments that helped stabilize occupation society. Emotionally, this was one of them because the tears represented more than gratitude. They marked the collapse of psychological distance between victor and defeated. The women inside those centers had lived through years where entire nations described each other as less than human. Yet, in the ruins of Tokyo, ordinary civilian clothing suddenly exposed the emptiness of that wartime hatred. The moment did not erase the atrocities of the Pacific War. It did not undo bombings, massacres, starvation, or imprisonment. But it revealed something history repeatedly demonstrates after great conflicts. Human beings often begin rebuilding civilization through the smallest gestures first. Meals shared between enemies, medic treating wounded prisoners, a blanket offered during winter, or a simple coat placed into the hands of someone who believed dignity had already vanished forever. Outside the relief centers, occupied Japan continued struggling through devastation and uncertainty. Black markets expanded. Returning soldiers searched for missing families. American jeeps rolled through shattered streets beneath occupation flags. The future of the defeated empire remained unclear. But inside those quiet rooms, something irreversible had already begun. The war between nations had ended in August. Now, slowly and painfully, the war inside human hearts was beginning to end as well. The winter of 1945 to 1946 became one of the most difficult periods in modern Japanese history. Despite the formal end of the war, survival itself remained uncertain for millions. Transportation systems barely functioned. Industrial production had collapsed. Food shortages grew so severe that occupation authorities feared mass starvation before spring. In some districts, civilians survived on diluted rice mixtures, sweet potatoes, or black market substitutes with almost no nutritional value. Former military personnel faced especially harsh realities. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were dismantled rapidly under Allied supervision. Officers lost rank, salary, and institutional identity almost overnight. Millions of soldiers and civilians stranded across Asia were repatriated back to Japan through overcrowded ports. Many returned to discover their homes destroyed and relatives dead or missing. For women who had served within wartime military structures, reintegration proved emotionally complex. Japan's surrender erased the social prestige once attached to imperial service. Uniforms disappeared from public life. Wartime organizations dissolved. Some former female officers struggled to find work in devastated cities, where even basic employment had become scarce. Others concealed their wartime roles entirely, fearing shame or resentment in post-war society. Yet, amid the collapse, the occupation also introduced changes that transformed women's lives in ways few could have imagined during the war years. Under Allied reforms directed by occupation headquarters, Japan began restructuring its political and social institutions. The new constitution, implemented in 1947, granted women legal equality and voting rights. Educational reforms expanded opportunities previously restricted by rigid pre-war systems. Women entered journalism, teaching, public administration, and professional careers in growing numbers during the post-war Reconstruction era. The contrast with wartime expectations was dramatic. Only a few years earlier, many Japanese women had been taught that their highest duty lay in sacrifice for empire and obedience to state authority. Now, occupation reforms emphasized individual rights, civic participation, and democratic citizenship. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Conservative figures criticized aspects of occupation influence, while others viewed American reforms as humiliating impositions from a defeated enemy. But for many ordinary civilians exhausted by war, stability mattered more than ideology. Food deliveries, functioning schools, reliable transportation, and heating fuel became immediate priorities. Within this environment, memories of small humanitarian encounters often endured with unusual emotional clarity. Former occupation workers later recalled how deeply clothing distributions affected both sides involved. Some American women described the experience as the moment they stopped seeing Japanese civilians only through the lens of wartime propaganda. Japanese recipients, meanwhile, sometimes remembered the gestures decades later as symbolic turning points during the darkest months after surrender. These memories rarely appeared in official military histories. Battles and diplomatic agreements dominated historical attention. Yet, oral histories collected in later decades repeatedly showed how personal acts of compassion shaped early occupation relationships more effectively than formal policy statements alone. Because in defeated Japan, dignity had become a fragile thing. And during that brutal first winter after the war, even simple civilian kindness could feel powerful enough to alter someone's understanding of the enemy forever. As the occupation continued into the late 1940s, Japan slowly began emerging from the physical ruins of war. Rail lines reopened. Factories restarted production. Burned neighborhoods gave way to temporary housing blocks and crowded reconstruction projects. Markets returned to city streets once filled with ash and twisted steel. Children who had spent the final war years hiding from air. Raids entered newly reorganized schools under a radically different national system, but the emotional reconstruction moved more slowly. The Pacific War had left deep psychological, scars across nearly every level of society. Millions carried memories of bombing raids, battlefield deaths, imprisonment, displacement, and hunger. Former soldiers often returned unable to speak openly about what they had witnessed. Civilians struggled with grief in cities where entire family records had vanished beneath firestorms. Women bore enormous portions of that burden. Widows managed households alone. Mothers searched for missing sons who never returned from overseas fronts. Former military nurses carried memories of overcrowded hospitals, filled with burn victims and amputees during the final bombing campaigns. Women who had served wartime organizations frequently entered post-war life with little recognition for what they had endured. And yet, many also became central figures in rebuilding Japanese society. By the early 1950s, Japan's recovery accelerated dramatically with industrial growth and economic reforms. New department stores appeared where ruins once stood. Western fashion returned to urban life. Civilian clothing, once scarce enough to provoke tears inside relief centers, became symbols of a modernizing society, reconnecting with the outside world. The memory of those early occupation encounters, however, retained lasting symbolic power. For some Japanese women, receiving clothes from American volunteers represented the first moment they understood the war was truly over. Not because surrender documents had been signed aboard the USS Missouri, not because imperial broadcasts announced defeat, but because ordinary human interaction replaced the rigid emotional world created by militarism. Historians examining post-war reconciliation often point to these personal experiences as crucial foundations beneath larger political recovery. Governments can sign treaties, armies can cease fire, but genuine normalization between former enemies often begins through smaller acts repeated quietly across everyday life: a shared meal, medical treatment, a classroom reopened, a winter coat given freely without humiliation. The United States and Japan would eventually become close allies during the Cold War era, bound by economic partnership and military cooperation. Only a few years after some of the fiercest fighting in modern history, American and Japanese societies began building one of the most significant post-war relationships of the 20th century. That transformation did not erase the suffering of the Pacific. War, the bombed cities, remained real. The dead remained dead. The atrocities committed across Asia remained part of historical memory. But reconciliation became possible because countless individuals on both sides gradually chose practicality, empathy, and reconstruction over endless hatred. And in the ruins of occupied Japan, some of the earliest signs of that change appeared not in conference halls or political speeches, but in quiet relief stations where exhausted women cried while holding ordinary civilian clothes for the first time in years. Wars are often remembered through explosions, generals, and maps covered in arrows. But history does not live only inside battlefields. Sometimes it survives in smaller moments. Moments so quiet they almost disappear. Beneath the scale of global events, a room in ruin. Tokyo. Winter light through broken windows. Former enemies standing face to face after years of hatred. The women who cried while receiving those clothes were not reacting to fabric alone. They were mourning an entire world that had collapsed around them. The empire they were taught to serve, the sacrifices they were told would bring victory, the years consumed by fear, hunger, and obedience, and the American women offering those garments carried their own scars from the Pacific War. They too had lived through loss, propaganda, uncertainty, and grief. Yet for a brief moment, none of that mattered as much as the simple act unfolding between them. one human being helping another survive the winter. The Second World War changed technology, borders, and global power forever. But its deepest lessons often emerge from moments like these, where ordinary compassion interrupts the machinery of destruction. Because in the end, civilizations are not rebuilt by victory alone. They are rebuilt when people who once saw each other as enemies begin, slowly, to recognize each other as human again.